New Mexico Territory, 1882. The night the desert turned to flood, the sky didn't just break open, it came down screaming. Water slammed through the gullies like a herd gone mad, dragging branches, fence rails, and a single veil that had once belonged to a woman promised to the wrong man. The veil caught on a cactus spine and tore in two. Ruth Avery didn't stop to look back. Mud sucked at her boots, the hem of her wedding dress heavy as a curse. The wind shoved her sideways, grit biting her face. Somewhere behind her, the train whistle she'd jumped from still howled, and she prayed it would keep heading north without her. Every step was a small rebellion against a lifetime of silence. She'd left behind more than Denver, more than the man her father chose to marry her off to. She left behind the version of herself that apologized for breathing too loud. Her lungs burned. Her fingers were bleeding where the rocks had skinned them, and the desert smelled like iron and smoke. She climbed the rise toward a dim orange glow, the kind of light men leave burning when they don't expect company. A firehouse, maybe? A barn? She didn't care. The storm was closing in again, thunder rolling low like the growl of something alive. Inside that glow, Mason Calder sat by an oil stove, sharpening a spade that hadn't tasted work in weeks. The rain drummed on the tin roof, steady as heartbeats. His dog, an old cattle mutt named Juniper, lifted her head before he did. Mason glanced at the door, jaw tightening. He told himself he was done with rescues. No more rushing into burning barns or drowning rivers. He'd promised his late wife, and then himself, that he'd never again stake his life on saving strangers. But promises, he knew, were paper in the wind when a knock came at your door in the middle of a storm. It wasn't a knock, not really, more of a crash and a scrape, like a ghost dragging her sins up the porch. Mason grabbed the lantern, unlatched the door, and froze. She stood there soaked, trembling, veil half torn, eyes wide with the kind of fear that doesn't beg, just warns. He took her in the way a man measures a wound. No judgment, only triage. "You lost?" he asked. Her mouth opened, but what came out wasn't an answer. It was a cough, rough and wet. She swayed once before catching the doorframe. "I need help," she managed. He should have said no. He'd rehearsed that word plenty, but the desert doesn't forgive hesitation, and something in her tone, the exact pitch between shame and defiance, cut through him cleaner than lightning. He stepped aside. "Come in before the wind decides for you." She crossed the threshold, dripping mud onto the pine floor, leaving small, ghostly footprints that the firelight licked gold. Mason shut the door behind her, slid the bar down, and the storm's voice faded to a muffled roar. "What happened to you?" She looked down at herself, torn lace, blood on her knuckles, dust crusted to her throat. "I was supposed to get married today." Mason's eyes flicked to the gold thread still caught on her sleeve. "Looks like you didn't." She shook her head. "No, sir. I ran." That should have been the end of it. He poured her water from a tin cup, watched her drink like she'd been thirsty for months. She said nothing else, and he didn't press her. The fire popped, Juniper circled twice, and lay down by the door. Mason nodded toward the back room. "There's a cot. You can rest. Storm won't quit till morning." Her eyes flicked toward him, wary, measuring. "You trust strangers easy?" "Don't trust anyone," he said. "Just not the kind to leave folks in a flood." Something in her face eased, a small unclenching. She wrapped the blanket he handed her tighter around her shoulders, muttering a quiet thank you that cracked on the second word. As she disappeared into the back, Mason caught himself watching the trail of muddy footprints drying by the stove like evidence of a story that had only just begun. He rubbed the edge of his wedding ring, the one he still kept on a string under his shirt, and felt the old ache stir again. He'd promised he wouldn't rescue anyone again. But that night, under a sky the color of bruised steel, he realized some promises weren't meant to be kept. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, two souls who had sworn themselves to silence began quietly, stubbornly to break it. By morning, the desert had rinsed itself clean. The storm left behind a bruised kind of quiet puddles flashing with sunlight, fence rails steaming, the air thick with sage and smoke. Ruth woke to that smell and to the sound of hammering somewhere outside the thin walls. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her fingers sank into the coarse wool blanket, the rough weave strangely comforting. She'd expected to wake up back in Denver, or worse, in her father's carriage, told to behave. But the walls were wood, not velvet. The light came from one cracked window. The silence was real. When she stepped out of the back room, Mason was already at the table, sleeves rolled, mending a length of hose. The house was small, one main room that served as kitchen, workshop, and everything in between. The smell of strong coffee covered the scent of burnt rubber. Tools hung on every wall, polished and arranged by size: axes, hooks, shovels, wrenches. He moved through them like a man who spoke in metal instead of words. "Coffee's on," he said without looking up. She nodded, rubbing her arms through the borrowed flannel shirt that swallowed her frame. "You were up early." "Didn't sleep much." He didn't say it like a confession, just a fact. Neither did she. The night had been full of dreams, faces she'd escaped, vows she'd never meant to make, hands that felt like property, not touch. She pushed the thoughts away and took a seat. The chair creaked under her, old pine with a split leg that had been fixed with a nail and a prayer. He poured her coffee, black and bitter. "Name's Mason Calder. Used to work the fire line up by Taos before I came down here." "Used to?" He gave a small shrug. "The line burned through more than timber." Ruth waited. He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. The scar along his forearm, pale and rope-like, said enough. "What about you?" he asked finally. "Ruth Avery." Her voice steadied as she said it. "My father owns half of the railway from Golden to Denver. Or he thinks he does." Mason's brow ticked up. "You ran from a rich man's house to end up in mine. That's new." "I didn't run from a house," she said quietly. "I ran from being traded like livestock." That shut him up for a while. The only sound was the kettle cooling on the stove, a soft click every few seconds. Mason stared into his cup, then nodded once. The way a man does when he's been handed a truth he respects, but doesn't know what to do with. "You can stay till the ground dries," he said finally. "That's a couple of days. You'll be safe here." She studied his face, the rough-cut beard, the eyes that looked like they'd seen both mercy and hell. "You sure about that?" He met her gaze evenly. "I don't say what I don't mean." Something loosened in her chest. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was air, the first clean breath in weeks. Later, she followed him outside, if only to feel sunlight again. The property was a scatter of sheds and broken fences, everything smelling faintly of oil and horses. A water tower leaned slightly to the west, and a bell hung near the roofline, dark with rust. "Used to ring that?" she asked. "When there were men to hear it." He spoke without bitterness, but his voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen people run toward danger until there was no one left to come home to. He picked up a wrench, tightened a bolt on the pump, moved slow, steady. She realized everything about him was deliberate, the way he spoke, the way he breathed, even the way he avoided looking too long. Inside, the fire crackled again. She took to sweeping the floor, more to fill the silence than for cleanliness. He didn't stop her. There was a rhythm to the morning that didn't need words, his tools clinking, her broom moving, the desert wind pressing against the window pane like a heartbeat from another world. At noon, he offered her bread and beans. "You eat slow," he noted. "Not used to being allowed to." He didn't smile, but something softened in his face, like pity stripped of its arrogance. "You're allowed to. Here." After they ate, she noticed the photo on the mantel. A woman with kind eyes and two small children, all framed in silver ash. "Your family?" she asked gently. "Was." He picked up the frame, wiped a bit of dust from the glass, then set it down again, face first. 5 years ago, Fireline caught the wind wrong. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "Me too. Promised I'd never fight another fire after that. Promised I'd stop trying to save what's already gone." She wanted to say something, that some things still could be saved, but the words stuck. The light outside had turned amber, desert dust floating in it like gold. Mason leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching the horizon. "Storm season's not done yet. You'll need dry clothes. There's a trunk in the loft. My late wife's sister left a few things. Thank you." He looked at her then, really looked, not as a stranger or a problem, but as someone who'd shown up at the exact wrong time and somehow made the room feel alive again. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We don't know each other." She smiled faintly. Seems we're both out of promises to keep. The wind caught the screen door, slamming it softly against the frame. He didn't move to fix it. She didn't flinch. And for a brief second, the distance between them two people, who'd both stopped believing in second chances, felt like the only thing holding the world steady. That night, Ruth found the trunk in the loft. Inside were a few folded dresses, simple calico and cotton, one stitched with a faint blue thread at the hem. It smelled like lavender and smoke. She held it up to the lamplight, her fingers tracing the seams. Downstairs, Mason oiled his tools one by one, arranging them back on the wall. Each clang was soft, respectful, like a ritual to keep memory at bay. When he set the last wrench down, he paused, staring at the empty spot where the old alarm bell rope used to hang. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Some promises burn cleaner than others." Ruth didn't hear him. She was standing barefoot at the window, watching the last streaks of lightning fade beyond the ridge. For the first time in months, she wasn't running. She was simply staying still. And in the quiet house full of tools and ghosts, that small act of stillness was the beginning of something that neither of them had words for yet. By the third morning, the mud had hardened into a crust of salt and dust, and the air smelled like something half forgiven. Ruth stood by the open door, sunlight slanting across her borrowed blue dress. The hem brushed her ankles, soft but practical, a working woman's dress. She'd found it in the trunk, ironed it by instinct, like an old reflex from another life. For the first time, when she caught her reflection in the window pane, she didn't see a runaway. She saw someone useful. Mason was already outside, sleeves rolled, checking the hoses stacked by the shed. He had a way of moving that made even silence look heavy. When she stepped out, he didn't glance over, just said, "Storm last week washed the fence out by the wash. I'll need to reset the posts." She hesitated then. "Show me how." That made him look up. He studied her mud on her boots, hair tied back, jaw set like someone who'd made up her mind. Then he gave a small nod toward the tool shed. "You ever dig post holes?" "I was raised with silver spoons," she said, "but I can learn." He smirked, the ghost of one. "Then start with that shovel." They worked side by side through the morning, the sun climbing slow, the rhythm steady shovel, turn, brace, tamp. She followed his lead, imitating the tilt of his shoulders, the push of his boot on the blade. Her palms blistered quick, but she didn't stop. He noticed without comment, and when she paused to wipe her brow, he handed her a strip of cloth to wrap her hands. "Blisters mean you're building something," he said. "Or losing something soft," she answered. He gave a single grunt that might have been approval. At noon, they rested in the shade of the tower, sharing water from the same tin cup. A hawk circled above, lazy and sure. Ruth watched it for a while before saying, "You keep this place too clean for a man who claims he's given up." He looked at her, eyes narrow under his hat brim. "You can quit saving people without letting everything rot. Is that what you tell yourself?" His jaw tightened. "It's what I tell the knights." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She looked away, toward the horizon where the river shimmered like mercury. Back in Denver, quiet meant danger. Here, it sounds safe. He didn't answer, but the line of his shoulders eased a little. That evening, when she started sweeping the porch, he didn't tell her to stop. She hummed under her breath a song with no words, something her mother used to hum while scrubbing laundry in the old boarding house. The sound carried through the open doorway, mixing with the smell of coffee and oil. Mason looked up from his workbench and for the first time in years, didn't mind the noise. Later, when the sun dipped low and the heat slipped away, he found her at the chicken coop crouched beside the nests. "They'll peck if you're too quick," he said. "Then I'll be slower." She reached carefully and a hen shifted without fuss. She held up the egg, fragile and perfect. "First time I've done anything that didn't feel borrowed." He nodded, half smiling. "Don't drop it then." That night, they ate simply bread, beans, and one egg fried in the pan. She offered him the larger half. He ignored the gesture, sliding his plate closer to hers. They ate in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that listens back. When the dishes were done, she wandered to the porch again. The moon hung low, fat and amber. Mason joined her, carrying his mug. "You thinking of going back?" he asked after a while. "I'm thinking of what I'd be going back to." She drew her shawl tighter. "A man who saw me as property." A father who measured worth in dowries and rail miles. No, Mason, there's nothing there but chains. He studied her profile, the curve of her jaw lit by the lamp's glow. Chains break different for everyone, he said. Some snap, some rust slow. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. And yours? He tapped the chain that held his ring beneath his shirt. Still rusting, I guess. She didn't push further. Instead, she said softly, you could take it off. I could, he admitted, voice low. But some promises, they're carved deeper than the scar that made them. She looked down, then reached for the lantern, turning the wick lower. Maybe one day you'll decide that carving's not who you are anymore. He watched her walk back inside the flicker of her shadow across the walls, the faint scent of lavender she carried from the trunk upstairs. Later, when he went to hang his tools, he noticed something on the workbench. His old spade, the one rusted from disuse, now polished clean. She'd scrubbed it, left it gleaming under the lamp. Next to it, a folded piece of paper. He opened it, her handwriting neat but firm. Tools don't save people. People save people. I'll be up early. He stared at the words, then at the spade, then out the window where the desert stretched wide and endless. For the first time since Ellie's fire, he felt something other than loss sitting in his chest. It wasn't peace. It was motion. Upstairs, the boards creaked once as Ruth turned in her bed. Mason blew out the lantern, the room falling into a comfortable dark. Outside, the wind moved through the fences they'd fixed together, carrying the faintest sound, not quite a song, not quite a sigh of two lonely hearts learning the slow language of staying. The wind shifted again by the end of the week, dry, restless, the kind that carried whispers from town before the riders did. Mason felt it first. The horses in the corral grew uneasy, stomping in place, ears twitching toward the ridge road. He paused from mending the water line, squinting west. Dust trail. One rider, maybe two. He cursed softly. Not because he expected trouble, because trouble always came on clear mornings like this. Ruth was by the porch, washing tin plates in a basin. The sun caught her hair, and for a moment she looked like a piece of the light itself, something too temporary to touch. He didn't want to break that peace, but peace was fragile country. Ruth, he called, low but firm. We've got company. She froze, hands still in the water. A beat later, she saw the dust too. When the riders came close, Mason recognized the first before he even dismounted a Pinkerton agent. Tall, tidy, with that polished belt and badge gleam that didn't belong to the desert. The second man was the local sheriff, his hat tilted low, eyes already avoiding Mason's. Morning, Calder, the sheriff said. Mason wiped his hands on a rag. If you're here about taxes, they're paid, not taxes. The agent spoke, smooth and rehearsed. We're looking for a woman, name of Ruth Avery. Mason didn't flinch. That's so? She's wanted for theft, the agent continued. Ran off with a man's jewelry and wagon after abandoning her wedding. There's a warrant out of Denver. Ruth's hands went white on the rim of the basin. Mason saw it from the corner of his eye. Denver's a long ride, Mason said. You sure you didn't take a wrong turn? The agent smiled thin. No mistake. There's reward money for anyone who helps locate her. Her father's quite concerned. The sheriff cleared his throat, uncomfortable. You seen anyone passing through, Mason? Mason looked at him long enough to make the man shift his boots. Ain't seen a soul worth writing about. Just storms and sand. The agent's gaze wandered to the porch. His eyes narrowed at the basin. The second cup on the railing, the faint shadow of a woman through the window curtain. You live alone, don't you? Prefer it that way. The agent stepped closer, the crunch of gravel loud as gunfire. You sure about that? Mason didn't move. You're trespassing on private land. You'd lie for her? Mason met the man's stare head on, voice calm as iron. No. But I don't lie to the wind, and it hasn't told me she's here. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather. Then the agent gave a little nod, smiling like a man filing something away for later. If she shows up, you'll send word. Sure, Mason said. If the wind carries it. They left slow, dust kicking up again. The sheriff didn't look back. When they disappeared over the ridge, Ruth stepped out. Her face was pale but steady. "You lied," she said quietly. "I protected you," he answered. "Why?" He hesitated long enough for truth to be the only option left. "Because I'm not letting some man's contract drag you back into a life you didn't choose. Not while you're under my roof." She stared at him, throat tight. "You don't even know me. I know what it looks like when someone stops running but isn't free yet." The words landed soft but deep, and she had to look away before they undid her. She walked toward the field, hands trembling, kneading the air. He watched her go, jaw clenched. Behind him, the old bell swayed once in the wind, its clapper knocking softly like memory trying to wake. That evening, Ruth sat at the table with the ledger open, though the numbers blurred. The warrant still echoed in her mind: theft, reward, unstable. Unstable. Her father must have written that himself. In his world, a woman who wanted her own choice was always unfit. Mason came in from the yard, shoulders dusted with dusk. He set a folded newspaper down beside her. "Red Rock Gazette," he said. "Picked it up when I rode for supplies." She didn't answer, so he went on. "Front page says the Pinkertons are taking private contracts now from rail barons, politicians, men like your father. Money turns lies into facts faster than fire turns wood." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. "He'll ruin you if he finds out." Mason leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I've been ruined before. Didn't take." That almost made her smile, but her voice broke instead. "They called me a thief." He looked at her, long and quiet. "You steal anything that belonged to you?" She met his eyes. "Just myself. Then they can keep the rest." Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering loose pages from the open ledger. One sheet fluttered across the table and caught on Mason's boot. He bent to pick it up, saw what she'd been writing: lists of repairs, rations, expenses, and at the bottom, in smaller writing, "Debts I refuse to owe." He folded the paper once, twice, and slipped it into his pocket. "You want to fight this, Ruth? You'll need proof, not words." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've seen men like your father. They keep their sins where no one looks. In the numbers, ledgers, contracts, shipment books. If he framed you, he left ink somewhere to prove it." She studied him, realization dawning slow. "You'd help me?" "I already am," he said simply. That night he found her by the window, staring out at the horizon. The lantern light caught her profile, fierce and weary at once. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that their reflections merged in the glass. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I know. And if they find me—" He paused then. "Then they'll find me first." She turned to him then, heart pounding at how steady he sounded, not a promise of safety, but a declaration of choice. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "I don't want you burned for my mistakes." He shook his head. "Maybe I need the fire. Been cold too long." The room went still. The storm had passed days ago, but something new had begun to gather, quiet, dense, and alive. Outside, the bell rope swung once, though no wind touched it. Somewhere, a page of the ledger lifted, drifted toward the stove's flame, and turned to ash before either of them moved to stop it. In that flicker, Ruth realized, sometimes truth had to burn before it could light the way back home. The wind that morning carried the scent of smoke, dry, metallic, wrong. Mason woke to it before dawn, the dog pacing at the door. He pulled on his boots, stepped outside, and saw it. A thin line of dark rising from the east ridge, too straight for a campfire, too wild for control. The old sawmill, maybe, or the wheat storage near the rail spur. The valley air was still, heavy with heat, the kind that kept smoke low to the ground. He went back inside, voice level but quick. "Ruth, get dressed. Fire's breaking out past the wash." She blinked herself awake. "It's miles from here. Not with that wind." He threw her his old canvas coat thick, scarred, smelling of pine tar and soot. "We've got less than an hour before it runs the creek bed." Outside, the sun came up red and swollen. The air hissed, alive with static. Mason hauled the pump cart from the shed, checking the leather seals. "You stay close, do what I say. You see the wind shift. You don't wait for me, you move." She nodded, gripping her gloves, fear plain but steady. "I'm not leaving you out there alone." He didn't argue. They rode hard. Dust churned under the wagon wheels, the mare lathered with sweat. By the time they crested the ridge, the eastern sky had turned the color of rust in embers. The sawmill roof was already gone, the barn beside it roaring like a living thing. Sparks rained down across the field, beautiful, terrible. Mason leapt down, uncoiled the hose, jammed the coupling to the pump. "We'll try to cut it off here," he shouted. "If it jumps the fence, the town's gone." Ruth's face was streaked with soot, her hair loose from the braid. "Tell me what to do." He pointed to the intake valve. "Keep water steady. If pressure drops, we lose the line." She nodded, gripping the handle, the wood biting her palms. The pump groaned to life, coughing water through the hose in sharp bursts. Mason took the nozzle, directing it at the flames crawling up the grass. The wind shifted, scattering ash across his face. He didn't blink. "More pressure!" he yelled. "I'm giving it all I've got." The hose bucked. Steam rose where water met fire, a hiss like anger finding its match. The world turned red and white and noise. Ruth coughed, her eyes burning. The pump handle jammed. She threw her weight into it, and it gave with a snap. The hose surged, then went slack. Mason looked back, saw her stumble, and ran. The heat hit like a wall. He grabbed her arm, dragged her toward the ditch. "Get down!" A timber from the collapsing barn broke free, crashing to the ground between them and the wagon. Fire leapt along the split boards, hungry and fast. "Mason!" she screamed. "Go around!" he shouted. But she didn't. She ran straight through the smoke, coat pulled over her head, boots sinking into burning straw. The world narrowed to breath and pain. She found him half buried under a beam, blood at his temple. His eyes flickered open, disbelief more than fear. "Ruth, don't talk," she snapped, shoving against the beam. It didn't move. Her lungs clawed for air. The heat seared through the coat. Somewhere, she heard the dog barking far, frantic. Mason tried to push himself up. "Leave me." She slammed her fist against the beam again. "You taught me better than that." With a final shove, the wood rolled just enough. She pulled him free, coughing hard, half blind from the smoke. Together they staggered toward the ditch where the air was cooler, the fire breaking behind them like a wave. They collapsed in the wet soil, coughing, shaking. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Mason, voice raw, "You could have died." "So could you," she whispered. He turned his head, studying her face through the grime. "Why?" "Because I was done being the one who needed saving." He looked away, eyes wet from smoke or something deeper. "You shouldn't have to prove you belong here by nearly burning for it." "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I needed to know I could stand in the fire and still choose to stay." Silence pressed around them, the kind that hums after near death, full of life's stubborn echo. The flames had turned to smoke now, the color of bruised silver. The sky above them felt too wide, too clean. Mason sat up, wiping the soot from his hands. "When my wife died, I swore I'd never step into another blaze. I thought that was strength. Turns out it was just cowardice with a moral badge." She reached for him, fingers trembling but sure, brushing the soot from his cheek. "You kept one promise tonight," she said. He frowned. "Which one?" "You said you wouldn't let the wind decide for me." He stared at her, then really saw her eyes alive, unbroken. The space between them felt like a held breath too long. He reached into his shirt, pulled the chain with the old ring from around his neck, and let it fall into his palm. The metal was blackened now, scorched from the fire. He stared at it a long while, then looked at her. "I made this promise to keep the dead close," he said, "but it kept the living away." Ruth met his gaze, then break it. He hesitated only a second before he unclasped the chain. The ring dropped into his hand, warm from his skin. Without ceremony, he set it into the dirt between them, half buried in ash. The sun broke through the smoke just then, a thin, golden line cutting across the field. Neither spoke. He reached for her hand, rough against rough, and for the first time, the contact didn't feel like rescue. It felt like agreement. After a while, Ruth said quietly, "What now?" He looked toward the blackened ridge. "Now we rebuild. And when they come again, we don't hide." The words landed like a vow, clean and sharp as rain on hot earth. The fire had taken half the fence, part of the roof, the old wagon, but in the smoldering ruin lay something neither of them had planned on finding. Proof that some promises are meant to burn, so the right ones can be made in their place. That night, the valley glowed faint under the stars, smoke still curling from the ashes. Ruth sat on the porch, the canvas coat draped around her shoulders. Mason joined her, bandage across his temple, cup of water in hand. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. Somewhere in the distance, the old bell finally fell from its beam, hitting the ground with a dull, solid sound, a sound like closure. Ruth didn't flinch. She just whispered into the cooling air, "Guess we'll need a new one." Mason nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, "something that rings for the living this time." The fire left a scar across the valley, a wide black seam cutting through the wheat and the pasture. For 2 days, smoke hung low, the kind that smelled less like destruction and more like something waiting to begin again. Mason's hands were raw from clearing the charred fence posts. Ruth's throat burned from the smoke, but she refused to rest. Together, they shoveled ash, stacked salvage boards, and hauled what could still be used. There was no speech about it, no division of labor. They simply moved in rhythm, as if the work itself had written its own instructions. By the third morning, a letter arrived, carried by a boy from the station. Mason saw the envelope before Ruth did. Heavy parchment, red wax seal. He knew that kind of letter. Men who sent such things didn't write for comfort. They wrote to claim. Ruth slid it open with the edge of a nail file. Inside was a single sheet, her father's handwriting sharp and unforgiving. "Return the stolen property, or face formal charges. I'll have you declared unfit and any man harboring you prosecuted." At the bottom, in smaller letters, "You've embarrassed this family long enough." She read it twice, then handed it to Mason. "He's not done yet." Mason folded the letter once, slipped it into the breast pocket of his work shirt. "Then neither are we." That afternoon, he hitched the wagon. "We're going to Arroyo Santo," he said. "Courthouse sits there. If your father's built his empire on fraud, he's left tracks. Freight ledgers, tax records, warehouse numbers, all public if you know where to look." Ruth's brows furrowed. "You mean to face him head on?" "I mean to face the truth head on," he said. "He can catch up if he wants." The ride into town was quiet, the desert stretching gold on both sides. When they arrived, the courthouse smelled of ink and dust. Ruth trailed her fingers along the ledgers, eyes tracing the columns of numbers, shipments, purchases, falsified routes. Then she found it, a record of jewelry shipments under her father's company name, dated after the day she supposedly stole them. Her breath caught. "He sold them himself," she whispered. "He built the lie, then paid to chase it." Mason leaned over her shoulder. "Print the page." They paid the clerk 2 dimes for a copy, then walked out into the afternoon heat. Ruth's hands shook as she held the paper. "This isn't just proof. It's freedom." "Proof is only freedom if you stand behind it," he said. "You ready to do that?" She looked at him, eyes clear, shoulders squared. "I am." They rode back by dusk, the valley bathed in the lavender light of evening. The charred posts still smoked in places, but already shoots of green grass had begun to push through the soot. Mason dismounted, unhitched the mare, and stood staring at the horizon where the fire had stopped, right at the edge of their land. "Guess the wind decided we'd had enough," he said. Ruth stepped beside him. Maybe the wind finally picked the right side. Inside the house, the table was cleared except for 2 things. The scorched ring he'd buried in ash, now resting on a folded scrap of cloth, and the paper copy of the ledger. Between them, a small wooden cross that had survived the fire, the edges blackened but the heart still intact. Ruth sat down, fingers brushing the burned ring. "You still keeping her close?" she said softly. "I'll always keep her close," he admitted, "but I'm done living behind her shadow." She took a slow breath. "Then we start new. Not with vows written for us, but with what we choose." He nodded, almost shyly. "What'd you have in mind?" "Something small," she said. "Something that doesn't need a preacher or a crowd. Just truth." He reached for her hand. "Truth I can do." They stepped outside, into the open dusk. The sky was wide and red, the hills glowing like coals cooling in the distance. Ruth held the paper in one hand, the burned ring in the other. For every lie he told, I'll make something honest, she said, voice steady. She tucked the paper into a tin bucket and lit it. The flame rose fast, golden blue. When it died, she poured the ash into her palm, let the wind take it. Then she looked at Mason. You once said some promises burn cleaner than others. Maybe that's how we keep them, by letting them burn first. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that starts in the eyes. Then what promise do we make now? Ruth stepped closer, until their foreheads nearly touched. We promise to stay, not forever, not till death. Just each morning until we choose again. He nodded, his breath catching. That's one I'll keep. He took off his gloves, and she slid the burned ring onto a piece of hemp string, tying it to the porch beam above their heads. The metal caught the last light of day, not as a relic, but as a reminder. That night, they sat on the porch eating bread still warm from the stove. The air cooling, the world strangely gentle. A coyote called somewhere beyond the ridge. And Mason said, "You realize you just gave up your father's fortune for a roof that leaks." Ruth smiled. It's the first roof that ever felt like mine. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, the space between his heartbeats felt steady. When the stars came out, she leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes half closed. "So," she murmured, "what do we call this place now?" He thought for a moment. "After what we've been through?" He nodded toward the horizon. "Call it second wind." She laughed softly, the sound carrying out across the valley. "That's fitting." The laughter faded into the hush of the night, and in that quiet, something settled, not the weight of an ending, but the calm of a beginning finally earned. By early spring, the valley no longer smelled of smoke. New shoots of wheat spread like a green sea across the blackened soil, thick and sure, drinking the melted snow from the hills. Mason built the new fence himself, one post at a time, the rhythm steady, like heartbeats finding their pace again. Ruth painted the boards pale gray, her brush leaving small, uneven strokes that caught the sunlight. The land that had burned was growing back quieter, stronger, different, just like them. At dawn, the rooster called, and she woke to the creak of the floorboards, the sound of Mason stoking the stove. The routine had become a kind of music: boots, kettle, whistle, breath. She moved through it easily, not as a guest anymore, but as part of the house itself. On the table lay the ledger, open to a new page. She'd written at the top, in clean ink, "Second Wind, Season 1. Mason came in, carrying a basket of fence nails. His hair had silvered a little at the temples from the sun, and the small scar at his temple had faded to a soft line. "You're up early," he said. "Habit," she replied. "The wheat's coming in faster than I thought." He looked past her, toward the field beyond the window. "You plant it, it grows. That's the deal." She smiled faintly. "If only people worked that way." He paused, then walked closer, setting the basket down. "Maybe they do," he said. "Just takes the right soil." That afternoon, she taught 3 women from town how to use the hand pump he'd rebuilt. They'd come shyly, hats in hand, curious about the firehouse and the woman who'd refused to go back to Denver. Ruth showed them how to prime the valve, how to feel for water pressure with their palms. Mason watched from the porch, arms crossed, quiet pride warming his expression. "Never thought I'd see the day women were teaching firecraft," he said later. "You didn't see the day," she replied. "You helped build it." In the evenings, when the work was done, they sat on the porch together. The old bell, the one that fell during the fire, had been remade into a wind chime, hung above the door. When the desert breeze moved through it, the tone was softer, deeper. Mason called it the siren that sleeps. "She only wakes when the wind gets lonely," he joked once. Some nights, Ruth read aloud from the local papers stories of small justice, new rail lines, neighbors rebuilding. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence to listen to the quiet, that thick, golden quiet that had once frightened her but now felt like home. "You ever miss the noise?" she asked one evening. Mason shook his head. "Noise took enough from me. I'll keep the quiet." She rested her chin on her knees, the lamplight catching the faint scars on her hands. "It's strange," she said softly, "how peace can make you ache more than pain did." He nodded, understanding without words. "That's how you know it's real," he said. "It doesn't have to shout." When summer came, the wheat turned gold, bowing in the wind. They harvested together, the sound of the scythe through grain like whispers of forgiveness. Ruth kept one stalk on the kitchen shelf in an old bottle, its head heavy, its stem curved from the storm. A reminder, she said, that what's bent can still stand tall. Sometimes they'd ride out at dusk, the mare slow, the air cool. Mason would glance at her and think how strange it was that a life could rebuild itself from ash without asking permission. She'd catch him looking and say, "Don't get soft on me, Calder." "Too late," he'd reply, grinning under the brim of his hat. In late August, a letter came again, sealed with the same red wax. But this one wasn't from Denver, it was from the courthouse in Arroyo Santo. The charges were dismissed. The theft, the warrant, all dissolved under the light of the evidence she'd brought forward. The paper was stamped. Closed. Ruth read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it under the burned ring that still hung above the porch. "Let it rest there," she said, "right between the fire and the wheat." That night, the stars burned clear and wide. They didn't talk about destiny or forgiveness or all the what-ifs that haunted other people. They simply sat two souls who'd spent too long fighting the wind, now letting it move through them instead. Mason reached over, took her hand, thumb tracing the small callus that had replaced her blisters. "You know," he said, "I used to think the hardest part of surviving was the fire itself." She tilted her head. "And now?" He looked at her, eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Now I think it's learning what to do with the quiet that follows." She smiled. "The kind that starts slow, deep in the chest. Then we'll fill it right." They rose before dawn the next morning. The first light hit the wheat fields, turning them to rivers of gold. Ruth walked ahead, her skirt brushing the heads of grain, Mason beside her with his hand resting lightly at her back. In the distance, the wind chime rang once a low, sweet note and then fell still. The world felt paused, suspended between breath and promise. Ruth stopped, looking out over the land that had once been ash. "We didn't build something grand," she said. Mason followed her gaze, quiet for a long time before answering. "No," he said. "We built something true." And as the sun rose over second wind, gilding every scar, every nail, every stubborn blade of wheat, the siren slept on, and the world kept its peace. When the world quiets, sometimes what's left isn't loneliness, it's peace asking to be noticed. Ruth and Mason didn't find perfection out there in the valley. They found rhythm, forgiveness, and a reason to stay. Maybe that's all any of us are trying to build, a place where the fire has already passed, and the air feels safe to breathe again. If this story found a soft place in you, tell me what part stayed the longest. Was it the promise, the silence, or the choice to rebuild? Share your thoughts below, and if you'd like to walk more dusty roads like this one, subscribe to No Knee Wild West Saga